Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The air was heavy with the scent of magnolias the day Josephine Hargrove arrived at Oakwood Plantation in the summer of 1886. The Civil War had been over for 2 decades, but its shadow still loomed over the Virginia countryside like the moss that draped from ancient oaks. The plantation had survived, though diminished, no longer the grand operation it once was, but still a symbol of faded Southern aristocracy. Hammond Caldwell was 45 years of age when he sought a bride to restore some semblance of dignity to his family name. The Caldwells had managed to retain ownership of their land after the war, unlike many of their neighbors, through a complex series of financial maneuvers and political connections. Hammond had spent years focusing solely on maintaining the plantation's productivity through the tenant farming system. His solitary existence in the great house had become a source of whispered speculation among the local gentry. It was through a correspondence arrangement with a matchmaker in Richmond that Hammond came to know of Josephine. She was presented as a refined young woman of 23 from an impoverished but respectable family in Maryland. Her letters were eloquent, her penmanship impeccable, and the daguerreotype she sent showed a woman of delicate features and thoughtful eyes. After 6 months of exchanged letters, Hammond proposed marriage, and Josephine accepted with apparent enthusiasm. The wedding was a modest affair by antebellum standards, but still the most significant social event in the county that year. The local gentry attended out of curiosity as much as courtesy. They studied the bride with the careful scrutiny that small communities reserve for newcomers. She was quiet but gracious, maintaining a dignified composure throughout the ceremony and reception that followed at Oakwood. What puzzled many guests was the absence of any family members accompanying Josephine. She explained that her parents had passed away, and she had no siblings or close relatives who could make the journey. This story was accepted without much question. The war and subsequent hardships had scattered or decimated countless families. The newlyweds retired to Oakwood Plantation, and the community turned its attention to other matters. For the first year, Hammond and Josephine appeared at church services and occasional social gatherings, presenting the image of a contented, if reserved, couple. Hammond seemed pleased with his bride, and Josephine appeared to be adapting well to her role as mistress of Oakwood. She managed the household efficiently, revitalized the neglected gardens, and was unfailingly polite during social calls. Yet there was something about Josephine that never quite sat right with those who encountered her. She possessed knowledge of social customs and cultural references that seemed inconsistent with her purported background. Sometimes she would use phrases or display skills that seemed unusual for a young woman of her generation. When questioned about such incongruities, she would smile and change the subject with practiced ease. Dr. Samuel Holbrook, the county physician who occasionally attended to residents at Oakwood, noted in his private journal that Josephine exhibited unusual behaviors during his visits. Mrs. Caldwell appears to possess a remarkable memory for certain historical events, he wrote, yet claims complete ignorance of others that any person of her age and background should recall. When I mentioned the great centennial celebration of 1876, she looked at me blankly before quickly recovering and claiming she had been ill during that time. Hammond himself began to notice peculiarities in his wife's behavior. He observed that Josephine never fully undressed for bed in his presence, always maintaining a high-necked nightgown and often wearing gloves to sleep. She explained this as modesty instilled by a strict upbringing. Perhaps most unusual was her habit of locking her bedroom door after Hammond fell asleep, something he discovered only by chance when he awoke one night and found himself unable to re-enter after stepping out. When confronted about this habit, Josephine explained that she often suffered from sleepwalking episodes as a child and had been trained to lock herself in as a safety measure. Hammond, not wishing to disturb the peace of their still new marriage, accepted this explanation despite his misgivings. As the seasons changed, Hammond found himself increasingly drawn to his mysterious wife, yet simultaneously disturbed by her. There was something in her eyes, a depth that seemed inconsistent with her youth, a knowing look that made him feel as though she were studying him like a specimen rather than loving him as a husband. Still, he dismissed these thoughts as the natural adjustment period of any marriage. In the autumn of 1887, approximately 15 months after their marriage, Hammond wrote to his cousin in Richmond, expressing subtle concerns about his wife. "Josephine is a most capable mistress of the household," he wrote, "but there are moments when I feel I am living with a stranger." Last week she referred to events from before the war with a peculiar familiarity, as though she had witnessed them herself, though she could not possibly have been born yet. When I remarked upon this, she became flustered and retired early, complaining of a migraine. The distance between them grew. They now occupied separate bedrooms, with Josephine claiming that Hammond's snoring disturbed her sleep. He noted that she seemed to age very little, her skin maintaining an unnatural smoothness that belied the harsh Virginia sun and the taxing nature of plantation life. When he commented on her youthful appearance, she attributed it to a secret family recipe for face cream and changed the subject. Martha Wilkes, who served as a cook at Oakwood, later provided testimony that was recorded in the County Historical Society's archives. Miss Josephine would spend hours in her private sitting room with the door locked. Sometimes I'd hear her talking, though there was never anyone else in there. At first I thought she might be praying, but the cadence was wrong. More like she was having a conversation with herself, but in different voices, one low and harsh, nothing like her normal speaking tone. During a particularly severe thunderstorm in the spring of 1888, lightning struck one of the massive oak trees near the main house. The resulting fire threatened to spread to the house itself, and in the chaos of evacuating, Hammond entered Josephine's private room for the first time in months. What he found there puzzled him greatly, a collection of personal items that seemed to belong to different eras, antique jewelry with styles dating back to the early 1800s, garments cut in fashions from decades past, and, most disturbing of all, a leather-bound journal written in what appeared to be Josephine's hand, but dated 1843, long before she could have been born. When Hammond confronted his wife about these discoveries, she became uncharacteristically emotional, claiming they were family heirlooms that she treasured for sentimental reasons. The journal, she insisted, had belonged to her grandmother, whose handwriting was remarkably similar to her own. Hammond, still infatuated with his beautiful young wife despite his misgivings, chose to believe her explanation. By 1890, Hammond's health began to decline. He developed a persistent cough and experienced increasing fatigue. Dr. Holbrook diagnosed a lung condition and prescribed various treatments, but Hammond's condition continued to deteriorate. Throughout his illness, Josephine was an attentive caretaker, administering his medicines and ensuring his comfort. Yet visitors noted a strange detachment in her manner, as though she were performing expected duties rather than tending to a beloved husband. Lucinda Barrett, the postmistress in the nearby town, noted in her personal correspondence that Josephine received regular letters from Baltimore, though she had claimed to have no connections there. When Lucinda casually mentioned these letters, Josephine explained them as communication with a former school friend. Yet the envelopes bore different handwriting each time and occasionally male names. As Hammond grew weaker, he became increasingly troubled by dreams, vivid nightmares in which he would see Josephine standing over his bed, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. In these dreams she appeared different, older somehow, with a hardness to her features that he never saw in waking life. He dismissed these as fever dreams, yet couldn't shake the unease they left him with. Dr. Holbrook, visiting more frequently as Hammond's condition worsened, began to develop his own concerns about Josephine. He noticed that medications he left seemed to diminish more rapidly than Hammond's prescribed dosage would account for. When he subtly tested Josephine's medical knowledge, he was surprised by her familiarity with terminology and treatments that would be unknown to most laypeople of the time. In his medical journal from this period, Dr. Holbrook wrote, "I cannot shake the feeling that Mrs. Caldwell possesses knowledge that exceeds her station and purported education. Today, when discussing Mr. Caldwell's treatment, she suggested an alternative preparation of laudanum that incorporates botanicals I have only recently read about in a medical journal from Edinburgh. When I inquired as to how she came by such knowledge, she claimed to have overheard it from a physician in her youth. Her explanation is plausible, yet I detect a calculation in her responses that troubles me deeply. Ist. As Hammond's condition continued to deteriorate, Josephine took increasingly complete control of the plantation's affairs. She reviewed accounts, met with the tenants, and made decisions about crop rotations with an unexpected knowledge of agricultural practices. When questioned about her expertise, she would smile and say that she was simply following Hammond's instructions. One of the field hands, Jeremiah Tanner, later reported a strange encounter during this period. He had come to the main house to discuss a matter with Hammond, only to find Josephine instead. She was sitting at the master's desk like she belonged there, he recalled, looking over some old maps of the property. When she saw me, she started talking about how the southeastern field should be converted back to cotton, mentioning something about the soil composition being ideal. Then she referred to a crop rotation system that had been used back in '45, as though she'd been there herself. Made no sense. She'd have been nothing but a babe then, if even born. In January 1891, during a brief improvement in Hammond's condition, he made a startling discovery. While looking for a document in his study, he found a false bottom in one of Josephine's drawers. Hidden inside was a collection of small vials containing unidentified powders and liquids, along with a notebook filled with what appeared to be medical formulations, written in a code he couldn't decipher. That night, Hammond refused the evening medication Josephine brought him. By morning, he appeared stronger than he had in weeks. When Dr. Holbrook visited later that day, Hammond asked to speak with him privately. What was discussed in that conversation was never recorded, but servants reported that Josephine was excluded from the room for over an hour, pacing the hallway outside with uncharacteristic agitation. The following night, Hammond suffered a severe relapse. By morning, he was delirious with fever, mumbling about the woman with many faces and eyes that never age. He died 3 days later, never regaining full lucidity. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, a common complication of his underlying lung condition. The funeral was attended by most of the county's prominent families, who came as much to observe the widow as to pay respects to the deceased. Josephine wore appropriate mourning attire and displayed conventional signs of grief, yet many commented on her composure. There were no tears, no collapse into hysteria that was often expected of widows in that era. Following the funeral, Dr. Holbrook requested permission to perform a post-mortem examination, citing medical interest in the progression of Hammond's lung disease. Josephine firmly refused, stating that her husband had expressed wishes to be buried intact. The doctor did not press the issue publicly, but in his private journal he wrote, "I am increasingly convinced that Hammond Caldwell's death warrants further investigation. The rapid acceleration of symptoms following our private conversation suggests intervention rather than natural progression. Without examination, however, my suspicions remain merely that." Within days of the funeral, Josephine announced her intention to continue running Oakwood Plantation rather than sell it or return to her purported family in Maryland. This decision raised eyebrows in the community. A woman managing such a property alone was unusual, though not unprecedented in the post-war South. What truly surprised people was her competence. Under her management, Oakwood began to prosper in ways it hadn't since before the war. In the summer of 1893, a stranger arrived in the county asking questions about Josephine. He identified himself as Theodore Hayes, a private investigator from Philadelphia. He took a room at the local inn and began discreet inquiries about Mrs. Caldwell, particularly focusing on her background before arriving in Virginia. Abigail Montgomery, who worked as a maid at the inn, later testified that she had overheard parts of a conversation between Hayes and a local man. The investigator was showing a photograph, asking if it was the same woman as Mrs. Caldwell from Oakwood. I caught a glimpse of it. Looked like one of them post-mortem photographs, a woman laid out for burial. Couldn't see the face proper, but the dress was fine, like something a wealthy lady would wear. Before Hayes could make much progress in his investigation, he was found dead in his room, apparently from a heart attack. The local physician found nothing suspicious, though he noted the man was relatively young for such a condition. His personal effects, including any documentation related to his investigation, disappeared before authorities could properly examine them. Following this incident, rumors began to circulate about Josephine. Some recalled stories they had heard about a notorious impostor named Lucille Montrose, who had married and buried 3 wealthy men in Maryland and Pennsylvania during the 1870s, before disappearing with their fortunes. The descriptions of this woman bore some resemblance to Josephine, though nothing could be proven. Josephine seemed unperturbed by the whispers. She continued to manage Oakwood with remarkable efficiency, though she gradually withdrew from social engagements. Her infrequent appearances in town revealed subtle changes in her appearance. Her hair, once a rich brown, now contained streaks of gray, though her face remained remarkably unlined. Some attributed this to her increasingly reclusive lifestyle, protected from the sun that aged so many Southern women prematurely. In the spring of 1894, Abigail Porter, the elderly aunt of Hammond Caldwell, came to visit Oakwood. She had been living in Europe for many years and had not attended the wedding or funeral. Within hours of her arrival, the household was disrupted by her screams. Servants rushed to find Abigail pointing at Josephine, her face contorted in horror. "You haven't aged a day," Abigail cried out. "You're her, aren't you? The woman who worked for my sister in Baltimore in the 1850s. The one who disappeared with her jewelry? I would know those eyes anywhere. They haven't changed in 40 years. Josephine denied the accusation, attributing it to the confusion of an elderly woman. She calmly suggested that Abigail needed rest after her long journey. By morning, Abigail was inexplicably eager to return to Richmond, refusing to stay another night at Oakwood. She left behind a letter addressed to the family lawyer, the contents of which were never disclosed. What was known was that Abigail Porter died less than a week later in her Richmond hotel room. The cause was listed as a stroke, not unusual for a woman of her advanced years. Yet the timing raised questions among those already suspicious of Josephine Caldwell. Following Abigail's visit, Josephine became even more reclusive. She dismissed several longtime servants, replacing them with workers from outside the county who knew nothing of local gossip. The only regular visitor to Oakwood was Dr. Holbrook, who continued to provide medical care when needed, and, unbeknownst to Josephine, to quietly investigate his growing suspicions. In his medical journal from this period, Dr. Holbrook noted, "Mrs. Caldwell requested a tincture for pain today, claiming to suffer from severe headaches. When I inquired as to the nature of the pain, she described symptoms inconsistent with any typical headache. More concerning was her request for a powerful sedative, which I declined to provide in the requested quantity. There is something in her manner that increasingly disturbs me, a hunger in her eyes that I cannot define. In the autumn of 1894, Dr. Holbrook traveled to Baltimore, ostensibly for a medical conference. His real purpose, as revealed in later correspondence, was to investigate Josephine's claimed origins. What he discovered was disturbing. No record existed of a Josephine Hargrove matching her description in the town she had named as her birthplace. Moreover, when he showed her daguerreotype to longtime residents, one elderly woman became visibly shaken. "That's Victoria Winters," the woman insisted. "She was married to my cousin's neighbor back in '62, disappeared after he died under mysterious circumstances. They said she went back to her family up north, but there was talk that she'd been seen with other men before her husband was cold in the ground." Dr. Holbrook extended his investigation to Philadelphia, where he made contact with colleagues at several medical institutions. His inquiries eventually led him to Bowman Asylum, where the superintendent, after some persuasion, shared a disturbing case history. In 1865, a woman named Agatha Blackwood had been committed to the asylum after the suspicious death of her husband. She was described as highly intelligent, manipulative, and suffering from the delusion that she could transfer her consciousness between bodies. What made her case particularly notable was a physiological anomaly. Despite being in her 40s at the time of commitment, she showed remarkably few signs of aging during her 20 years of institutionalization. Dr. Marcus Pierce, who had overseen her case, wrote in his notes, "The patient exhibits an unnatural retention of youth that defies medical explanation. While her chronological age advances, her physical appearance remains largely unchanged. She attributes this to what she terms the transfer, a process by which she claims to maintain her existence by appropriating the life essence of others." More disturbing still was the record of Agatha's escape in 1885. She had apparently formed an attachment to a young nurse at the asylum, a woman named Eleanor Hargrove. Both women disappeared on the same night. Eleanor's body was discovered 3 days later in a boarding house, the cause of death undetermined. Agatha Blackwood was never found. The description of Agatha from the asylum records bore a striking resemblance to Josephine Caldwell, though the age would have been inconsistent with her apparent youth. The coincidence of the Hargrove surname, however, could not be overlooked. The winter of 1895 was particularly harsh. Heavy snowfalls isolated Oakwood from the nearby town for weeks at a time. When the roads finally cleared in February, Dr. Holbrook was called to the plantation to attend to Josephine, who had reportedly fallen ill with influenza. What he found disturbed him greatly. Josephine was indeed weak and feverish, but what caught the doctor's attention were peculiar marks on her neck and wrists, what appeared to be old scars that had been concealed by her high collars and ever-present gloves. When he attempted to examine these marks more closely, Josephine became agitated and ordered him to leave. In his journal that night, Dr. Holbrook wrote, "I am increasingly convinced that Mrs. Caldwell harbors some terrible secret. The scars I glimpsed today were consistent with restraints of some kind, perhaps from a lengthy institutionalization. This would explain certain peculiarities in her behavior and knowledge. I fear for the safety of those residing at Oakwood and have resolved to make my findings known to the authorities." Before Dr. Holbrook could act on his resolution, he received an unexpected visitor. Josephine arrived at his office the following evening, claiming she had recovered from her illness and wished to apologize for her rude dismissal. She brought a bottle of fine brandy as a peace offering, suggesting they share a drink to restore their cordial relationship. The doctor's housekeeper, Mary Sullivan, later recounted that the two spent over an hour in his study. When Josephine departed, she appeared calm and collected. Dr. Holbrook, however, was not seen again that night. By morning, his office was empty, with no sign of disturbance except for 2 empty brandy glasses. A search was organized when the doctor failed to appear for his scheduled appointments. His horse and buggy were found abandoned near the river, suggesting he might have fallen in and drowned. His body, however, was never recovered, despite extensive dragging of the waterway. Josephine expressed appropriate shock and concern over the doctor's disappearance, even offering a reward for information leading to his discovery. Privately, however, she took steps that suggested foreknowledge of his permanent absence. Within days, she had sold several valuable pieces of jewelry and transferred substantial sums from Oakwood's accounts to banks in Richmond and Baltimore. The spring of 1895 brought new intrigue to Oakwood. A stranger arrived claiming to be James Hargrove, Josephine's brother, previously unmentioned in any of her accounts of her family. He was a tall, slender man with a scholarly demeanor who explained his sudden appearance as the result of recently discovering his sister's whereabouts after years of separation. Those who encountered James Hargrove found him oddly familiar, though none could place exactly why. He moved into Oakwood with minimal luggage and immediately took an interest in the plantation's affairs. Like Josephine, he displayed knowledge and skills that seemed incongruous with his claimed background, particularly regarding medicine and chemistry. Most peculiar was the relationship between Josephine and her supposed brother. Servants reported that they often spoke in hushed tones, sometimes arguing intensely before falling silent when others approached. They shared meals in private rather than in the dining room and were rarely seen together outside the house. Henrietta Jackson, a housemaid at Oakwood during this period, later testified there was something unnatural in the way they looked at each other, not like brother and sister at all, and sometimes, when they thought no one was listening, they'd talk about the most peculiar things. Once I heard Mr. Hargrove say, "The transfer is failing earlier each time. We need a more permanent solution." Miss Josephine just laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. In June 1895, James Hargrove departed as suddenly as he had arrived, supposedly to conduct business in New York. Josephine explained his absence would be extended, as he planned to travel to Europe to investigate potential investments for Oakwood's expanding operations. Following his departure, Josephine's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would disappear for hours into the wooded areas of the plantation, returning disheveled and distracted. She began keeping a journal, writing in it compulsively at all hours. Most concerning to the household staff was her growing fixation on the abandoned slave quarters, a cluster of small buildings that had been left to decay since the end of the war. Josephine ordered these buildings cleaned and repaired, claiming she intended to convert them to tenant housing. Yet once the repairs were complete, she forbade anyone from entering them, keeping the keys on her person at all times. Lights were seen in these buildings late at night, and strange smells, chemical odors, and, more disturbing, what some described as the coppery scent of blood, occasionally wafted from them. In July, a young woman named Sarah Winters arrived at Oakwood, inquiring about a position as a lady's companion. She was pretty, with a delicate build and refined manners that suggested good breeding fallen upon hard times. Josephine hired her immediately, seeming almost eager to bring this stranger into her increasingly isolated household. The relationship between Josephine and Sarah developed with unusual rapidity. Within weeks, they were inseparable, with Sarah accompanying Josephine even on her mysterious excursions to the renovated quarters. Servants noted that Sarah seemed to grow increasingly subdued in Josephine's presence, developing a vacant expression that contrasted sharply with her initial vibrance. Martha Wilkes, still employed as cook at Oakwood, later recalled, "Miss Sarah came to me one evening, shaking like a leaf. She said she'd seen something in the old quarters that frightened her terribly. Before she could explain, Miss Josephine appeared and took her away. Next morning, Sarah was calm as could be, but different somehow, like something behind her eyes had gone out. In August 1895, the county sheriff received an anonymous letter describing suspicious activities at Oakwood Plantation. The letter detailed concerns about possible unlawful imprisonment and referenced the unexplained disappearances of both Dr. Holbrook and several transient workers who had briefly been employed at the plantation before vanishing. Before the sheriff could investigate these claims, a more pressing situation arose at Oakwood. Sarah Winters was found wandering along the road to town, disoriented and covered in blood. When questioned, she claimed to have no memory of how she came to be there or whose blood stained her clothing. Physicians examining her found no injuries that could account for the blood, but noted her extremely weakened condition and peculiar mental state. The sheriff, accompanied by several deputies, proceeded to Oakwood to question Josephine about the incident. They found the plantation eerily quiet, with no sign of the house servants or field hands. Josephine received them in the parlor, composed and elegant as always, though observers noted a strange intensity in her manner. She expressed shock at Sarah's condition and suggested the young woman must have fallen victim to some sort of attack while walking on the plantation grounds. When the sheriff requested permission to search the property, particularly the renovated quarters, Josephine's demeanor changed subtly. She became evasive, claiming that certain areas were unsafe due to ongoing renovations, and attempted to direct the search away from specific buildings. One deputy, separating from the main group, discovered a disturbing scene in one of the outbuildings. A room had been set up with what appeared to be medical equipment, surgical instruments, bottles of chemicals, and, most alarmingly, restraints attached to a sturdy table. The floor beneath this table was stained with what looked like blood, some of it fresh. Before the deputy could alert his colleagues, he was confronted by Josephine. Witnesses later reported hearing a gunshot, followed by shouts. By the time the sheriff reached the building, it was ablaze, the flames spreading with unnatural speed. The deputy was never seen again, presumed to have perished in the fire. The fire quickly spread to adjacent structures and eventually to the main house itself. Despite efforts to control the blaze, Oakwood Plantation was largely destroyed. When the flames finally died down, the search for survivors and victims began. Several bodies were recovered, burned beyond recognition. It was assumed that Josephine and any remaining staff had perished in the conflagration. A funeral service was held for the victims, with the remains interred in the Caldwell family plot. The community mourned the tragic loss, and Oakwood Plantation, with no heir apparent, was sold to satisfy outstanding debts. The new owners chose not to rebuild the main house, using the land solely for agricultural purposes. Sarah Winters, the sole known survivor of the Oakwood tragedy, was placed in the care of the county hospital. Her mental condition improved gradually, though she never fully recovered her memories of the events leading up to the fire. What she could recall, however, painted a disturbing picture. She would talk to me for hours. "Hey," Sarah told investigators, "about living forever, about transferring between vessels." I thought it was just philosophical discussion at first, but then she started showing me her journals, dozens of them dating back to the early 1800s, all in the same handwriting. She said they were her personal history, that she had lived through multiple lifetimes by moving from one body to another. Sarah described witnessing what she called the preparation, Josephine creating tinctures and powders from plants grown in a private garden behind the quarters. She said her original body was long dead, but her essence continued. Each transfer bought her decades, but never enough. She was seeking permanence. Most disturbing was Sarah's account of the days immediately preceding the fire. She told me I had been chosen, that my body was compatible. She said it was an honor, that I would provide the vessel for her next journey while my consciousness faded away. When I tried to flee, she restrained me. The last thing I clearly remember is a bitter liquid being poured down my throat as she whispered, "Soon we will be one." Marastir. Medical examinations of Sarah revealed puncture marks at the base of her skull and strange chemical compounds in her bloodstream that defied identification with the science of the time. Her account was officially attributed to trauma-induced delusions, and the case was closed with the conclusion that Josephine Caldwell had perished in the fire. The story might have ended there, becoming just another tragic footnote in county history, if not for a curious encounter reported by Reverend Thomas Whitfield in 1896. While traveling to a clerical conference in Baltimore, Reverend Whitfield claimed to have seen a woman bearing a striking resemblance to Josephine Caldwell boarding a steamship bound for Europe. The woman was elegantly dressed and accompanied by a distinguished-looking gentleman. When Reverend Whitfield called out, "Mrs. Caldwell," the woman turned momentarily, her eyes meeting his, before her companion hurried her away. The Reverend's account was largely dismissed as a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps a grief-induced delusion. Josephine Caldwell was dead, her remains buried in Virginia soil, yet his insistence planted seeds of doubt that would germinate in local lore for generations. In 1910, during renovations of the old courthouse, a packet of documents was discovered behind a loose panel in the records room. Among them was a sealed letter from Dr. Holbrook, dated March 1895, addressed to the county sheriff, but apparently never delivered. The contents of this letter cast a disturbing light on the Oakwood tragedy. Dr. Holbrook had written, "My inquiries have yielded disturbing information regarding the woman known to us as Josephine Caldwell. I have confirmed that no Josephine Hargrove matching her description ever existed in the Maryland town she claimed as her birthplace. More alarmingly, I have received correspondence from a colleague at Bowman Asylum in Pennsylvania who believes our Mrs. Caldwell may be none other than Agatha Blackwood, a patient who escaped from their facility in 1885. The doctor's letter continued with a description of this Agatha Blackwood, a woman of remarkable intelligence and persuasive abilities, who had been committed after allegedly poisoning her husband. According to asylum records, she possessed an unusual condition that her doctors termed arrested aging, appearing much younger than her actual years. Most disturbing was the final paragraph of Dr. Holbrook's letter. I have reason to believe that Mrs. Caldwell is aware of my suspicions. Yesterday I discovered that someone had searched my office, and my private journal is missing. I fear that by the time you receive this letter, I may have joined the growing list of those who have encountered this woman and met with misfortune. Should anything happen to me, I implore you to investigate Oakwood Plantation immediately." The discovery of this letter prompted a brief renewed investigation in 1910, but little could be determined after so many years. The graves at Oakwood were exhumed, but the remains provided no conclusive evidence. Fire had consumed most identifying features, and the forensic science of the time was limited. The case was officially closed again, though it continued to inspire speculation. In 1912, a retired medical examiner from Baltimore published an account of a strange case he had encountered in 1852. He described the death of a wealthy merchant named William Winters, whose young wife, Victoria, had been suspected of slowly poisoning him. Before charges could be brought, Victoria Winters had disappeared, along with a substantial portion of her husband's fortune. The examiner included in his account a daguerreotype of Victoria Winters. Though the photographic quality was poor by early 20th century standards, the resemblance to Josephine Caldwell was striking. More significantly, the examiner noted that Victoria Winters had possessed a peculiar medical anomaly, a small crescent-shaped birthmark behind her left ear, identical to one that several witnesses had mentioned observing on Josephine. In 1921, a journalist researching crimes of the previous century interviewed Augustus Reed, a former attendant at Bowman Asylum who had worked there during Agatha Blackwood's confinement. Reed's recollections added another disturbing layer to the mystery. She wasn't like other patients, Reed recalled. Most of them deteriorated over time, but she remained sharp, calculating. She would manipulate staff and other patients alike, forming alliances that she discarded when they no longer served her. And she had this theory about transferring consciousness, not just as a delusion, mind you, but as a procedure she had developed. According to Reed, Agatha had conducted crude experiments on small animals smuggled into the asylum. She claimed she could move her consciousness from one creature to another through a combination of chemical compounds and what she called sympathetic connection. Hafiznas most doctors dismissed it as lunacy, but Dr. Pierce became obsessed with her case, documenting everything. After she escaped, all his records disappeared. The most compelling evidence linking Agatha Blackwood to Josephine Caldwell came in 1932, when the journalist's research uncovered a diary belonging to Eleanor Hargrove, the nurse who had disappeared from the asylum the same night as Agatha. The diary, found among the possessions of Eleanor's distant relative, contained entries describing Agatha's growing influence over her. The final entry, dated just days before the disappearance, read, "A has convinced me to help her escape. She promises we will travel to Europe together once she accesses her hidden funds. I know I risk my position and reputation, but her arguments are persuasive, her vision of our future together compelling. She says we are compatible in ways I cannot fully comprehend, that we will be joined in a manner more profound than mere companionship. Tomorrow night, when Dr. Pierce is away, we will make our attempt." In 1942, the remains of a woman believed to be Eleanor Hargrove were discovered during excavation for a building foundation in Philadelphia. Forensic examination revealed a fractured skull and evidence of a surgical procedure performed at the base of the skull, a small, precise hole drilled into the bone, similar to those later found in Sarah Winters's medical records. The Oakwood Plantation case continued to resurface throughout the 20th century, inspiring numerous theories and investigations. In 1953, during renovations of an old hotel in Paris, workers discovered a hidden compartment containing various documents and photographs. Among them was a diary written in English dating from 1897 to 1899. Though the author identified herself only as J, several entries referenced Virginia and specifically the tedious years at O's, where I nearly lost myself in the performance. More disturbing was a photograph found with the diary showing a woman in fashionable European dress of the late 1890s. Despite the different hairstyle and clothing, those who compared it to the surviving daguerreotype of Josephine Caldwell noted unmistakable similarities. Most unsettling was a journal entry dated December 31st, 1899. Another century approaches, and with it, another transformation. I have selected my next vessel with care, a young Russian aristocrat with access to the Tsar's court. How strange to recall that once, long ago, I feared death. Now, having mastered its evasion, I find myself occasionally longing for its simplicity. Yet the hunger always returns, and with it, the necessity of continuing this existence. Hammond was fortunate in his way. He never realized that for 10 years he shared his bed not with a wife, but with something far older, wearing her discarded form. The diary and photograph disappeared from police evidence storage in 1954, and their current whereabouts are unknown. Official history records Josephine Caldwell as a victim who perished in a tragic house fire in 1895. Yet in the county where Oakwood Plantation once stood, locals still tell stories of a beautiful woman with ageless eyes who arrives as a stranger, marries into prosperity, and leaves behind only ashes. In 1967, an elderly woman named Margaret Allen was admitted to a nursing home in Boston. She claimed to be 122 years old, though her documentation indicated she was a more reasonable 87. The staff noted her unusual mental acuity and her extensive knowledge of historical events, particularly those of the 19th century, which she discussed with the intimacy of personal experience. What drew the attention of researchers interested in the Oakwood case was Margaret's collection of personal items, which included jewelry pieces matching descriptions of those owned by Victoria Winters in the 1850s and Josephine Caldwell in the 1890s. When questioned about these items, Margaret would smile enigmatically and change the subject. A nurse who cared for Margaret during her final illness reported a disturbing incident. In her last days, when the morphine had loosened her tongue, she would talk about people long dead as if she had known them personally. She spoke of a plantation in Virginia, of a doctor who had grown too suspicious, of countless others she had worn over the centuries. Most disturbingly, she described a process of transfer, a ritual involving specific pressure points at the base of the skull, and a concoction she called the elixir. Nones, the way she detailed it so methodically. It was as if she were giving instructions. Margaret Allen died in 1968, apparently of natural causes related to advanced age. An autopsy, performed at the request of researchers investigating longevity, revealed several anomalies. Her brain showed none of the typical signs of aging, and there was evidence of surgical scarring at the base of her skull, similar to that found in both Eleanor Hargrove and Sarah Winters. Most puzzling of all was a small notebook found among her possessions after her death. Written in a cipher that took cryptographers months to decode, it contained what appeared to be a step-by-step procedure for consciousness transference, along with chemical formulations and anatomical drawings focusing on the brainstem. The final page bore a list of names and dates stretching back to 1788. The last entry read, Margaret Allen, 1968-19, with the final digits left blank. The notebook was sent to a university research laboratory for analysis. Before any conclusions could be published, the laboratory suffered a devastating fire that destroyed all samples and research materials. The lead researcher died in the blaze, and the project was abandoned. In 1982, a woman calling herself Victoria Caldwell purchased the land where Oakwood Plantation had once stood. She was described as being in her late 30s, with striking features and an authoritative manner. She commissioned archaeological excavations of the plantation ruins, claiming historical interest as a distant relative of the original owners. Local residents who encountered Victoria noted her intense interest in the Josephine Caldwell story and her extensive knowledge of plantation history. Several people commented on her resemblance to the surviving images of Josephine, attributing it to family genetics. The excavations focused particularly on the area where the renovated slave quarters had stood. Though official reports detailed only historical artifacts of the expected type, rumors circulated about more disturbing discoveries: surgical implements, unusual glass containers, and a small room with restraint fixtures embedded in the walls. After 6 months of intensive work, Victoria Caldwell departed as suddenly as she had arrived, leaving the excavation unfinished. The property was sold again, and the archaeological sites were filled in by the new owner, who had no interest in the historical aspects of the land. In 1995, exactly 100 years after the Oakwood fire, a series of unusual disappearances occurred in the county. 3 young women vanished over a period of 2 months, all last seen in the vicinity of the old plantation land. Though extensive searches were conducted, no traces were ever found. During the investigation, several witnesses reported encountering an elegant, middle-aged woman who had been asking questions about the history of Oakwood. She claimed to be a historical researcher, but left no contact information and could not be located for questioning after the disappearances began. The most recent chapter in this disturbing saga came in 2015, when a manuscript was submitted to a small historical journal specializing in Southern Gothic literature, titled The Vessel Journals. It purported to be the collected writings of a single consciousness inhabiting multiple bodies from the late 18th century to the present day. The editors initially dismissed it as fiction, albeit remarkably well-researched fiction that incorporated accurate historical details about numerous eras. What changed their perspective was the inclusion of specific information about Josephine Caldwell and Oakwood Plantation that had never been published, details that could only have been known by someone who had been present. The manuscript described the process of transference in clinical detail, a combination of chemical compounds and precise manipulation of the brain stem that allegedly allowed the writer's consciousness to move from one body to another, leaving the original consciousness to fade and eventually disappear. Most disturbing were the descriptions of the writer's time as Josephine Caldwell. The plantation years were among my most peaceful, one passage read. Hammond was an ideal host, wealthy enough to provide comfort, isolated enough to allow my experiments, and sufficiently besotted to overlook inconsistencies in my performance. Had the doctor not grown suspicious, I might have remained at Oakwood for another decade before needing to transition. The journal described the fire as a necessary but regrettable conclusion to the Josephine chapter. When containment fails, elimination becomes necessary. The doctor, the brother, the girl, all loose ends that threatened exposure. Fire has always been my preferred method of obliteration. It leaves so little evidence and provides such a convenient exit. The final pages of the manuscript contained what appeared to be a coded message, along with a modern address in New Orleans. When investigators attempted to locate this address, they found it belonged to a historical society that had been destroyed in a fire just days before their arrival. The original manuscript disappeared from the journal's offices before it could be properly authenticated or published. The editor who had been working with it resigned suddenly and moved away without forwarding information. Attempts to locate her have been unsuccessful. To this day, the true story of Josephine Caldwell and Oakwood Plantation remains shrouded in mystery. Was she merely an unusual woman whose eccentric behaviors spawned exaggerated tales? Was she an impostor who created a new identity to gain wealth and position? Or was she, as the more fantastic theories suggest, something else entirely? A consciousness that had found a way to transcend the natural boundaries of life and death, moving from one vessel to another across centuries. What we know with certainty is that, in 1886, a woman calling herself Josephine Hargrove arrived at Oakwood Plantation as a bride. For 10 years, she shared the plantation owner's bed, his name, and his life. And in 1895, Oakwood Plantation burned to the ground, taking its secrets with it, or so it seemed. In the county where Oakwood once stood, locals still speak in hushed tones about beautiful strangers with knowing eyes, about people who seem oddly familiar, though they have never been seen before. They warn against inviting unknown persons into your home, against sharing too much personal information with elegant women who ask probing questions about family history. And on certain nights, when the wind blows through the ruins of Oakwood's foundation, some claim they can hear the faint sound of a woman's laughter, not the joyful laughter of a young bride, but something ancient and hungry, echoing across time. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the disappearances that continue to occur in the region. Not frequent enough to establish a pattern, but regular enough to maintain the legend. Every decade or so, a young woman vanishes, leaving no trace, and shortly afterward, a new resident arrives in some distant community, wearing a face that no one recognizes, but carrying memories that span centuries. Is Josephine Caldwell truly gone, Or does she walk among us still, wearing a new face, seeking her next vessel, continuing an existence that defies our understanding of life and death? The evidence remains inconclusive, the witnesses unreliable, the documentation incomplete. But perhaps, dear viewer, the most troubling question is not who Josephine Caldwell was, but where she is now. In the time you've been watching this narrative, have you felt a presence behind you, a subtle shift in the air, the weight of ancient eyes studying your reactions? Look around you. Are you truly alone? Or has something been drawn to you by this telling, something that recognizes in you the potential for its next transformation? Sleep well tonight, and perhaps as a precaution, lock your bedroom door.